It's always great. Two great friends of the Walker. Christopher Monkhouse, who many of you will know from the MIA, is now the Eloise Martin Curator and Chairman of the Department of European Decorative Arts at the Art Institute of Chicago, which is actually a shorter title than your previous title, I think. So you're making progress. And he was actually a contributor to the exhibition catalog, and he'll discuss the design of the Miller House in Columbus, Indiana, Saarinen's residential masterwork. And following him will be Tom Fisher, Dean of the College of Design at the University of Minnesota, and a great friend and partner on this project, as well as many others, who will discuss Saarinen's legacy for contemporary architecture. Tom, besides being dean, is also the author of numerous books, including his most recent Architectural Design and Ethics, Tools for Survival, which I see is now listed on Amazon, so it must be out and about. So without further ado, please help me welcome Christopher Monkhouse.
Well, one of the advantages of coming late in the day is that the subject of my talk needs no introduction. Starting with last night's wonderful discussion with Baldassar Korab and his family, we've kept hearing about the Miller House again and again, and we've heard a little bit this morning talking about his religious architecture, about Miller himself as a patron, but we haven't really seen this great patron, Irwin Miller, and his wife Zania, who I have on the screen. This is your first introduction to them. The Millers are a very interesting family, and it was actually Leon Sikowski who reminded me that in a profile in, we think, Fortune magazine in the 60s, it was even suggested that he would make very good presidential timber for the United States of America. And given his many accomplishments, which I'm going to briefly recite, one can well see why that was suggested. Well, I'm talking about a private residence in the public realm, the J. Irwin Miller House in Columbus, Indiana. Despite Irwin Miller's public roles in business and banking, religion, education, politics, and the arts, he actively guarded his and his family's privacy. Eero Saarinen and interior designer Alexander Girard had proved sensitive to these concerns when collaborating on the family's Canadian retreat. In a sense, that 1950 commission served for both designers and clients as a dress rehearsal for the Columbus project that immediately followed in 1953-57. Since winning the 1948 Jefferson National Expansion Memorial Competition in St. Louis, Saarinen's projects tended to be media events. For the Miller House, however, client and architect went out of their way to avoid attention. Miller selected a site of roughly 15 acres on the edge of Columbus, a far less conspicuous location than the large, prominently situated brick house of his childhood, which I might add, if you knew what to look for when Jennifer showed the Tabernacle Church this morning, the photograph of it, you could just see on the left an axial view of that in-town house. The landscape served as a fortress-like barrier. And here you see the house placed on top of the berm here, with one side of the house overlooking a floodplain of the Flat Rock River, and this photograph was taken from the edge of the Flat Rock River, and the other three enclosed by staggered hedges of tall arborvitae. And here's one of them, and then another. And of course, this might remind some of you of a certain residence in Wayzata, where, again, Dan Kiley, who was responsible for these arborvitae hedges, also left his handiwork. Landscape architect Dan Kiley created a series of outdoor rooms in tree-lined alleys to echo the house's grid pattern. Saarinen repaid the compliment by introducing large expanses of glass on three sides of the Miller House to Kiley's landscape, so that Kiley's landscape could be fully appreciated from within. Miller intended to maintain the low profile of his single-story, flat-roofed house by severely restricting the house's appearance in publications and forbidding any mention of his name, the house's specific location, or its cost. What did appear in print, however, extended the Miller House's impact on domestic architecture throughout North America and abroad. The professional architecture community was treated to its first peak in the September 1958 issue of Architectural Forum. Arresting plans and details from Saarinen's office were greatly enhanced by stunning images from world-renowned architectural photographer Ezra Stoller, the only photographs Saarinen and the Millers allowed to be published. Starting with title, A Contemporary Palladian Villa, the author went to great effort to draw parallels between the Miller House and Palladio's Villa Rotonda in Vicenza, Italy, built 4 centuries earlier. Thumbnail sketches, oops, let's go next forward. Here are those thumbnail sketches. There's the Villa Rotonda. This is the Miller House with the 4 private areas, which we've already been introduced to. This is the master bedroom, children's area. This is where the guest room, servants, as well as car, and then down here is the kitchen. Thumbnail sketches illustrated the author's contention that both structures utilized 4 loosely connected houses, performing separate functions, arranged around a central dominant space, which in turn reached out into the surrounding landscape on all 4 sides. The article got it all wrong, according to Kevin Roach, associate architect for the project. Roach had been expecting critics to describe the Miller House in Misesian terms, and in the process, zero in on their real source of inspiration, Mies van der Rohe's Barcelona Pavilion of 1929, and I think we could also add the Farnsworth House. House and Garden's February 1929 issue propelled the Miller House into the consciousness of the general public. The Miller House served as its hallmark house for 1959, the third in a series of houses selected for having met the following criteria, and I quote, "Our measure is the value of the house in human terms, a measure that comprises exhilarating space to move about in, visual richness to delight the eye, a total environment to nurture the spirits of the people who live in it." Through the eye of Ezra Stoller's lens, the house appeared on the front cover, followed by more than 20 pages within, including 6 in full cover and in full color. And here I just want to make an aside. I'm very grateful to Judy Dayton for many reasons, and in particular for this lecture, lending me her much treasured copy of That House and Garden. And as you see, it's still very much a precious relic from the family archive, which I have been assured I must return upon the end of this lecture. But it also is so important for this audience because this shows, again, the popular reception of the house through these 2 journals. This is the one that Ken and Judy saw that inspired them to ultimately build their Romualda Jurgala house in the 60s, and of course their Vince James house now. So this is just one example of how the Miller House literally comes home for us in this community. This is the power of House and Garden, which perhaps today we don't put is in such an influential plane, but it was then, as this article, this pivotal article, makes so readily apparent. The article mentioned neither Palladianism nor Mies, instead invoking a surprising reference to vernacular sources. And I quote, "The great center area is a big, handsome, festive meeting room for activities and entertainment. Inspired by old Midwest farmhouses, where all rooms opened on a common room, it has the same magnetic effect, expresses the common unity of the family." What did Kevin Roach think of that? Although not quite what the architect had in mind, the farmhouse comparison was easily overlooked when seen in the larger context of the article. House and Garden proudly presented the house room by room, as Zania Miller might have done for her guests. And I'm now going to give you a sort of room by room tour. Aspects that sparked the imagination and led to imitation began with the entrance hall, opening onto the great central living room. A floor-to-ceiling panel functioned as a theater curtain. This is the area last night that Baldassar Korab mentioned to us that he specifically worked on. And you're going to now see a series from the Yale archive of little photographs of maquettes as he endlessly came up with combinations ultimately for Saarinen to either select or reject. But first of all, I want to show you the screen that acted as like a theater curtain, and it also acted as a place for art. Now, the Millers never considered themselves art collectors. The art came after the house and was clearly meant to just enhance the daily experience. One of the first works they acquired was the one that you're now going to see. Oh, sorry. There we are. Pressed the wrong button. This is a Picasso from 1911, a still life of a carafe and a glass. This was bought in 1962, so it's very early in their collecting, and not surprisingly, they put it on the entrance screen, and it was still there when I had the privilege to visit the house in 1994. I'm going to come back to the role of the art in the house later, but they never considered themselves collectors per se. Now there's the other side of the screen. It hid the stage set on the other side and helped anchor the freestanding fireplace in the round to its left. Now this is the area which Baldassar Korab spent a great deal of time thinking about and making models to consider all the possibilities. Ultimately, it's a very simple one that they came up with, but initially, and this is one of the archival photographs, the fireplace in the round, the cylindrical fireplace, was going to have two walls flanking it, and then another alternative, and there are about 12 different alternatives, was this more bowed version of two walls flanking the fireplace as to serve as anchors. I think we can see why we're happy that got rejected. This is another cylindrical view, freestanding, and this time with a canopy around it. And of course, that might make you think of Canada, which I'll be showing you in a minute. Freestanding fireplaces became very popular in the 1960s, and the Miller example no doubt contributed to that trend. The simple cylindrical shape fitted well into its marble-lined environment. Its strategic location offered unobstructed views from the den, where the fire's glow complemented that emanating from the television screen, and from the dining room and living room, where the crackling flames enhanced the animated discussion taking place at the table or in the conversation pit. Reminiscent of a campfire, it also served as the centerpiece of the Millers' less formal living room in Canada from 1950, which Saarinen with Girard also worked on. And it's interesting, in one of those alternative designs for the fireplace in the Miller house in Columbus, they came up with a solution very similar to this indeed. The principal backdrop for the fireplace along the east wall of the living room was a 50-foot-long shelving unit, a detail of which appeared on the magazine's cover. Designed by Alexander Girard and inspired by one George Nelson developed for Herman Miller in 1946, it reads like a three-dimensional mural. Girard alternated panels of rosewood doors, hiding a television screen, bar, record player, and storage for camera equipment, with open shelving for books and multicolored niches for precious objects. Since its brilliant interpretation in the Miller house, the Kunstenwunder camera look for living rooms has never gone out of fashion. Guests could enjoy drinks and conversation before dinner by the fire, where seating furniture was always close at hand. though I might add, absent in the photos by Stoller, who removed the furniture to emphasize the uninterrupted flow of space, which again is another point. Photographs aren't always honest in what they show us in terms of how the family actually lived. The dining room beckoned from behind curtains that could be opened dramatically to reveal a special table setting. There we are. The massive circular table allowed Saarinen to revisit a similar 1929 table his father designed for Saarinen House at Cranbrook. But unlike Eliel's wooden table, Arrow's pedestal and 96-foot diameter surface were made entirely of marble. Most significantly, the flared cone support encased a brass pump mechanism that supplied water to a recessed bowl, which could function as a fountain, a fully planted garden, or a pool for lilies and orchids. And there you see one of the place settings of the table. And also, it's wonderful in the exhibit that the Millers have lent some of the very china you see in this iconic photograph. Although the Stoller photographs taken shortly after the house's completion shows Charles Eames' chairs with steel Eiffel Tower legs, they were immediately replaced as soon as Saarinen's iconic tulip chair went into production. The tulip chairs reinforced the design of the table and dramatically reduced the clutter of furniture Saarinen called a slum of legs. And it is interesting in terms of the family's perception of their own house. When I was talking to their daughter, Betsy, who's an old friend, and I was making reference to the Stoller photograph, which for most people is the only view they know of the house, that there were Eames chairs. And she said, no, there were never Eames chairs in my parents' dining room. We always used the Saarinen tulip chair. So here's another instance of photographs being deceptive. For after-dinner coffee and socializing, guests could retire to the center of the living room, where they descended into a recessed space with built-in seating, variously described by Forum and House and Garden as a conversation center, conversation pool, or a lounge pit. As Stoller's photography makes clear, the recessed pit allowed the western view of Dan Kiley's landscape grounds to be enjoyed without any distraction. There we are. This novel concept in social engineering could well be the Miller House's most influential innovation. It inspired a flood of imitations throughout the 1960s and early 1970s. The House and Garden article's reception could not have been more positive, starting with a letter to Arrow and Aileen Saarinen and Kevin Roach from Edgar Kaufman Jr., then the Museum of Modern Art's curator of architecture and design, whose father hired Frank Lloyd Wright to design Falling Water. Kaufman observed, quote, "House and Garden made your work look splendid and filled me with respect. A major job of architecture in the rounded sense," end quote, Edgar Kaufman. As the article described the 10-foot wide terrazzo surrounding the house as a, quote, "a sort of Arabian Nights platform," and the conversation pit in the living room as an oasis, perhaps it is not surprising that it inspired a Middle Eastern construction company out of Bahrain, and I show you a letter from the archive, to inquire about purchasing the Miller House's plans for an unnamed, quote, "prominent personality belonging to the ruling family of Bahrain." Needless to say, Saarinen declined the opportunity. The house also captured the imagination of House and Garden's general readership, including a reader with the suggestive initials TLC, of Cleveland, Ohio, whose letter to the editor enthusiastically praised, quote, the wonderful storage wall in the living room which is really a work of art. She did express some reservations, however, and I quote, maybe I'm old-fashioned, but the conversation pool reminds me of a jazzed-up Roman bath. But I do realize this is a new idea in living room seating, and like all such concepts, takes a little getting used to by us older folks. It looks mighty comfortable, but isn't flexible. I'm afraid it would frustrate me, for I'm one of those housewives who really enjoy rearranging the living room now and then for a change of scene, end quote. Had TLC visited the house in person, she may have discovered that climbing in and out of the pit proved challenging for older folk, eventually compelling the Millers to install a handrail. Saarinen and Girard have been moving toward the fully developed conversation pit in their respective work for some time. As early as 1941, Saarinen, with his father, introduced a partially sunken living room in the A.C. Wormuth House in Fort Wayne, Indiana. He further examined the idea in his highly visible 1945 case study house number 9 for John Intenza. Saarinen expanded the reach of the conversation pit by using one as the lounge's central feature in his 1958 Emma Hartman Noyes House dormitory at Vassar College in Poughkeepsie, New York. First published in Architectural Record in September 1959, it looked as modern as a recently landed flying saucer, and must have inspired more than a few progressive Vassar alums to consider one for their own home. Paul Rudolph did as much as any architect to promote the conversation pit, starting with one in his New Haven office where he met with potential clients. They frequently appear in his well-regarded Florida homes from the 1960s, and in turn inspired a series of lively cartoons by Alan Dunn for the Architectural Record, of which I show you just one. This is the first of 4 that Alan Dunn did. That one is for small talk. And I think when features of this nature get turned into cartoons, particularly in places like the New Yorker, you know you're on to something. This is something new. It's creating a lot of talk, as it were. And it is interesting, Paul Rudolph probably took the conversation pit to the highest level of execution, and it's probably one of his, perhaps his greatest domestic work, which I just happened to have the privilege of seeing last weekend when I was in Fort Worth, Texas. And this is the Sid and Ann Bass House of 1970, which doesn't have one but 2 conversation pits in a perfect state of preservation. Of all the ripples emanating from the Miller's conversation pit, perhaps none was more poetic than that from landscape architect Dan Kiley. Having worked with Saarinen on the grounds for the St. Louis Gateway Arch and the Miller House, Kiley was uniquely qualified to carry the conversation pit into the garden. In the early 1960s, Minnesotan couple Stanley and Bill Gregory provided Kiley with the opportunity at their fortress-like house near Lake Minnetonka, coincidentally, House and Gardens Hallmark House for 1968. Working with Chicago architect Ike Coburn, Kiley created a dining terrace that tied in perfectly with his ongoing exploration of the interplay between inside and outside space. He introduced a square recess with built-in seating, and a center table. As if to emphasize the connection with Saarinen and the Millers, a fountain bubbled up from the table's base, as you see here. The Miller House remains Saarinen's most fully realized example of domestic architecture. Through its appearance in Architectural Forum and House and Garden, in such thoughtful and creative responses as Kiley's alfresco conversation pit, the house exerts an influence well beyond its role as a very private residence in a small Midwestern town. I now want to consider two other aspects. One is the ripple effect, and like all things, the conversation pit, having been out of fashion for a long time, sort of written off as a architectural cliche, but like all things, they have a way of coming around again. This just happens to be an instance that appeared in the New York Times back last November. This is in London, and it's for Richard Rogers' son. And this is one in Thailand that appeared last winter in the New York Times. Just two further indications that the launching pad for the conversation pit, i.e. the Miller House, is still alive and well and as influential today as it was when it was built. But there's another part to the Miller House story. And also turning to the popular press again, many of you may have seen in 2007, in June, there was a reference to a painting sold by the Miller family that brought a record, a Monet, for about $80.4 million. The Millers have, or their children have indeed, sold the art from the house, which presents a very interesting situation. But the first thought is, oh, the art's gone, does that mean the house is next? And the good news is, and I think I'm at liberty to mention, the fact that the family do appreciate that the Miller House is a very special legacy of their parents, not to mention Eero Saarinen and his office, and that it should be preserved. And therefore, they're making every effort to work out an arrangement with the Indianapolis Art Museum, highly appropriate in view of the fact that Zania Miller in the 1970s got the Indianapolis Art Museum to have a satellite art gallery in Columbus, Indiana, for changing exhibitions. There's already a nice relationship there. And one likes to think that the sale of the art might also help endow this endeavor. So there's a lot of positive things that can come of this. And this is a photograph I wanted to share with you because it shows the Monet, the most valuable work in the house. It shows Irwin Miller playing not only a violin, but a Stradivarius violin. He is truly the modern Medici, and that is his daughter-in-law playing accompanying him at the grand piano. But it's important to realize the art, as I said early on, they never wanted to be thought of as collectors. It was there merely to enhance the bones of the architecture which they were privileged to live in. And so this painting, in fact, came very late into their possession. It actually had belonged to his sister, and she left it to her brother in 1993. So it came very late on in the history of the house. And also, it's interesting to note that here in the little red button doesn't want to work, but in the niches of the Alexander Gerard storage units, some of the folk art that was originally housed in there have been replaced with small works of art that appealed to them over the years. On the left, I'm going to show you a detail in a moment, is a Matisse from 1904, and on the far right is a Boudin. And here we are. This is the Matisse, and this is the Eugene Boudin. Their tastes were primarily French art, 19th and 20th century. He particularly liked Picasso's still lifes with guitars in them, probably a reference to the fact that he played a violin. Well, the art, as I said, is gone. This also pertains to two sculptures outside the house. This is this alley of honeysuckles planted by Dan Kiley. Dan Kiley always meant this alley not to be read as an alley with an axial feature at either end, but more like a loggia of columns which you look through out to the floodplain. So this sculpture in the foreground by Henry Moore from 1957 wasn't acquired by the family till 1971. The alley, in other words, had been in place for over 15 years. At the far end is a Lipschitz, still life, actually incorporating a guitar again. and that was acquired in 1977. And even Dan Kiley said himself, "I've never thought that these were integral to my project." Well, the fact is they're not now. They have been sold as well. But I leave with this image to point out that this is one instance where the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. And even though the art may have left the house, it was never central to the house, never central to its design. The house itself has such good bones, such a beautiful use of material, the best materials, the detailing is exquisite, not to mention the bucolic setting in which it finds itself. This is all in place indeed. This may be an example of when less is truly more. So when this house is open to the public, the people will see it as Ezra Stoller has turned it into a visual icon for us. It'll revert back to its early life in House and Garden and Architectural Record. And then we'll also join a great tradition of historic house museums from the 20th century, which preserve such masterpieces as Frank Lloyd Wright's Falling Water, not to mention his two Taliesin's, Corbu's Villa Savoie, Mises' Farnsworth House, Johnson's Glass House, and even Gropius's Lincoln House in Lincoln, Massachusetts. And now we hope, sooner than later, because you're going to be in for a great treat, this little architectural mecca in the Midwest called Columbus, Indiana, will now have a missing element for people who've gone to visit it for its many architectural wonders over the year. They're now going to be able to see a masterpiece of domestic architecture by Eero Saarinen for one of his greatest and most informed clients, Irwin and Zania Miller. And I can't think of a better conclusion to this symposium in terms of preservation and as well as the preservation of the legacy of Saarinen, not to mention the Millers. Thank you very much.